Thank you very much, and I welcome all of you tonight for part 3 in our series. And tonight we'll be focusing in on depression. Those of you who might have been here either in the past 2 weeks, we started by talking about bipolar disorder. As we continue forward with the series, we're going to talk about schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress disorder, and then in the final week of the series, one that I invite everyone back to, where we talk about helpful roles and skills that you as a family member can take with your loved one, regardless of what condition or what illness we're referring to, just the ways that you can be of best help, best support for your loved one. So as we begin tonight, I'd like you to just consider these following examples. A young woman, aged 28, a few weeks after giving birth to her first child, experiences sadness, disconnection from her baby, crying a lot, feeling very inadequate to be a mother. A man, 54 years old, loses his job, adds to the tension he's experiencing in his marriage, finds himself irritable, unable to sleep, starts to drink more. A 36-year-old woman, experiencing hopelessness and suicidal thoughts, withdrawing and sleeping a lot, sometimes with the help of sleeping pills. Has a background history of abuse in her childhood and has had a real struggle to maintain a good relationship. A young adult, 22 years old, 6 weeks after the breakup with his first girlfriend, finds it difficult to concentrate, grades are slipping, doesn't want to hang out with his friends, and questions why he just can't get over it. So 4 examples which can sound very different. Folks at different phases of life, experiencing different stressors, even different patterns of symptoms are going on with them. But what they have in common is we can call what all of them are experiencing depression. So we start to think about depression. It's important to realize that there are many faces to depression. And so it can look very different from person to person and over time. Depression has many aliases, if you will. There was a TV show a few years back called Alias, and the main character in Alias, who was a spy, she was an agent, and she could go wherever throughout the world, and what she would say is, well, I can be whoever I want to be. And kind of pass herself off in that way, no matter where she went. And depression is kind of like that. Depression can be whatever it wants to be. It can appear as isolation, from rejection, confusion. It can show up more as worthlessness or irritability. It can have many different faces and many different appearances. So what that says to us as we begin tonight is that it's so important, vitally important, that we begin by understanding the person's own experience of what it is they are going through. Whether they call it depression or not, we start by understanding the experience of the person. We can take our knowledge and our information, you can take some of what you will learn here this evening, and it can be very helpful whether you are suffering from depression yourself, or whether you're here because of a loved one, a family member, or a friend. You can take that information in. Again, most importantly, hear the experience of the person, and don't try to fit the person to the textbook. Rather, take that textbook information, if you will, and see how it does fit and help you in understanding and working with that person who is suffering from depression. And despite these many aliases, and with these aliases, depression can remain very hidden, yet it is quite prevalent. Major depressive disorder, clinical depression, lots of terms we can use for that, but if we just call it most commonly depression, major depression is the leading cause of disability in the United States for ages 15 to 54. So the young adult, late teens, young adult population, we're talking about the #1 cause of disability. And we might not think that. Major depressive disorder affects almost 15 million Americans every year, roughly 7% of the US population, adult population. in a given year. So again, while it can remain hidden, we know it is certainly quite common. A few more facts about it. Major depression can occur at any point in the life cycle. At any point. That median age of onset is 32. But again, it can occur at any point in time. Now we know, maybe in contrast to disorders like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, where for the vast majority it's going to be that late teens, young adult when they hit. And there's a lot of biological reasons that play into that. With depression, it can occur at any point in time. Given that major stressors can lead to depression. And those certainly we experience at any point in life. We do know that major depression is more prevalent in women than in men. And again, lots of reasons that could play into that. Whether we just look at the fact that women are going to be more likely to acknowledge dealing with emotions and having an emotional disorder, or being willing to seek help, more so than men will. So in many respects, depression in men is very much a hidden condition, and one that it's so important when we hear stories of it out in the public square, and we hear perhaps celebrities come out and acknowledge dealing with the condition. Also important to know that depression can occur in conjunction with other conditions. Substance abuse is going to be very common. It just kind of makes sense, doesn't it? If I'm really struggling, I'm in a real low place, I'm in depression, I want something either to pick me up or just escape from this. Alcohol is going to do a good job of that. Other drugs are going to do a good job of that. So it makes sense why we'll see that. Anxiety disorders are going to be very common. Anxiety, depression go hand in hand. Sometimes they just kind of intermingle and it's hard to tell which is which, or which seems worse. They may just seem like they come together, and so often they do. So it'll be important for us to be able to take that part of it into account as well. So, putting this out there, our goals for tonight are first to kind of learn about the causes and different types, the prevalence, which we've already talked about, of depression. So just to give an overview in that way of it. We're going to talk about what is the criteria of a depressive episode. You know, in our everyday language, the word depressed is used a lot and thrown around a lot. And so we want to be clear, okay, when we're talking about depression, clinical depression, what is it we're talking about? What is the criteria for that? What are we looking for? How long do we need to see those things before we start looking at that? I'm going to take that symptom list and then give us a more holistic view, if you will, of depression, and seeing how, rather than just seeing it as a list of different symptoms, we experience depression physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, relationally, all aspects of our being, right? Our body, our mind, our relationships, our soul, how depression hits us on all levels. Again, it's a very much more experiential way of understanding it. So we want to do that tonight. And then we're going to talk about treatment for depression. And we'll touch on medication, we'll touch on therapy, and maybe a little bit beyond that as well. So that's where we want to head tonight. Again, just a reminder, we'll take a brief break about halfway through our evening. So you can have a little refreshments and take a break. And I always save time at the end for questions. And so definitely be open to all your questions too. So first, to put us in context a little bit. Talked about this for those of you who came to the lectures on bipolar disorder. First thing we're talking about depression, is we're talking about it in the context of moods. And what are moods? Moods are the overall tone of our internal state. It's a simple way of defining what a mood is. It's the overall tone of our internal state. The simple question, right? How are you feeling? It's looking at in a technical way, I'd say just the tone of what's going on inside of you. And when we look at that, we all experience moods. And we experience a range of moods. Not so much distinct states as they are, as they fall into a range. And when we're in a kind of healthy or normal, if you will, state, fancy term for that is a euthymic state, I'm in a good mood. That green zone there in the middle is that healthy place. Those of you here, we talked about bipolar disorder, we talked a lot about the upside. When the energy, the mood goes up, we call that hypomania and mania. So that's heightened mood. Sometimes we might think of it in terms of energy, that it's heightened energy, too much energy in the system. What we're focusing on tonight is going to be the lower end of that spectrum. How we go from maybe a healthy place, that normal mood, and we will go downward. And we're going to look at the low side. And when we go into the low side, we're going to want to tease out a little bit as we go gradually down in there. The first thing we'll talk about, we want to differentiate, is depression and the blues. The blues is something that I think probably 99.9% of people have a sense of what the blues are. We go through a down period, something hits us. We know what that's like. We want to be clear that that is going to be distinctly different from depression. We'll talk about that more as we go on. So we're talking about what happens as we start going down, lower into that space, and hit on depression. So let's talk about depressive disorders. As we do this, what I'm going to do is just give you an overview of what are the different depressive disorders that are in our current, what is known as the DSM. The DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. I brought it along just to show you. It's a 900+ page manual. The 5th edition of the DSM actually just came out in June. So it's been updated, research, of course, lots of committees and study, and of course debate on what to include, what not to include, what to take in, what to put out, all of those things. And so this is our 5th edition. I show it to you not so that you run out and get this. The DSM is not meant to be a self-help manual. It's really just designed for the clinician to have some guidelines. It's kind of the encyclopedia of all the different psychiatric disorders. But when you hear about it, when you hear about the DSM, this is that big book that's out there. So don't run out and get it. Don't use it to try and diagnose yourself. Too often, when we learn about this stuff in grad school, that's our biggest danger. We start reading it and we diagnose ourselves with everything we're reading about. So the caution why I caution you not to run out and get this big old 900+ page book. And one of the changes that happened with this edition of the DSM is no longer is there one category of mood disorders, and we have depression and bipolar disorder under that category. Now, in the newest edition, bipolar and related disorders are just a separate chapter, if you will, from the depressive disorders. And so we have the depressive disorders. What we're going to be talking about, most prominently, we're going to focus tonight on what's called major depressive disorder, clinical depression, sometimes known as unipolar depression, in contrast to bipolar. You think of poles in bipolar disorder, the two poles of mood, the highs of mania, the low of depression. Unipolar, one pole, we're just looking at when we go down to the low pole of depression. This is primarily what we're going to be talking about tonight. When you hear depression talked about, this is what it is. So that just you're aware of what some of the other ones now in there. Persistent depressive disorder, dysthymia, and this one has been around for a while, called dysthymic disorder in our older versions of it. And here what we're just talking about is more of a low-grade persistent depression. In fact, to be diagnosed with this, we're going to see more depression than not over a 2-year span. So this is when I have kind of that, again, low-grade chronic depression. Not going to hit the severe lows that we'll talk about in major depression. But it'll almost feel a bit like it's my personality state. I'm just always feeling this kind of low sense of depression. That's what we might call dysthymia. One that there was a lot of study and obviously a lot of controversy and debate around is this new one that's now included in the DSM-5 called premenstrual dysphoric disorder. And obviously there's a lot of debate in trying not to pathologize what happens when a woman goes through her cycle. What they've included here as a disorder is the recognition that there can be, for some women, real marked disturbance in mood or anxiety, depression, irritability. In some women, again, during that final week before their period, and which will start to diminish and mood will start to improve in the few days after that. And another key part of that is just the awareness that when that comes in, it does really impair the ability to, if you will, function in the community as we would like. Work, school, relationships, and the like. So it's seeing it that, again, not to pathologize what is a normal part of biology and chemistry, but to see that there are times when it does take on that distinct role in impairing the person from being able to do what they really want to do. Another new one is called disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. And this is one which the essential hallmark here is going to be real irritability and outbursts of temper. And these severe and recurrent outbursts can happen either verbally or behaviorally. They're actually seeing this to be quite common in children being brought to mental health clinics for treatment. And it was also kind of brought in as a separate diagnosis because most of these kids were just being diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And so it's a differentiation now from bipolar disorder. And one of the differences is that in bipolar disorder, we will see distinct episodes, depressions and manias, whereas here we're talking more about the persistent kind of irritability and outbursts that can happen. And again, always seen in children. Any adult that would be diagnosed this, part of the criteria is that it was present before age 10. So again, really we're going to probably see this one again more in kids as we go forward, and more as a way to differentiate what some kids are suffering with and not have them all lumped as bipolar disorder. Also important to know that some substances, drugs, alcohol, can induce depression, and if it's just the result of the substance, that's another way it can be diagnosed. And then lastly, there are these two categories, other specified and unspecified depressive disorder, which the simplest way to put it is they're more like catch-all terms. When it doesn't fit as neatly into one of the other categories, there's still depression going on in some way, we would kind of put it here. So those are the different types of disorders that are in that DSM. We're going to be focusing in on major depressive disorder, helping you understand that and what to do with that. In depression, again, as I mentioned, there can be other disorders, but there can be just other kind of factors to consider as we start looking at these disorders. So let me first give you the criteria of depression itself, and then we'll look at some of the other factors that can come into play. So we start looking at the diagnosis of depression. First of all, you'll see that we're going to want to see at least 5 of the list of symptoms I'll give you over a 2-week period. So you start seeing these, and you had a bad day. We all have bad days. 2 weeks of at least 5 or more of these. Number 1, probably quite obvious, just that sense of a depressed mood. Number 2, we call this anhedonia, that lack of interest in pleasurable activities. Things that I used to enjoy, I just no longer enjoy. And this is kind of a common experience in depression. And a lot of times it's just the awareness that I know I usually like this, it just doesn't do it for me. I'm not enjoying it, not enjoying life. Significant change in both appetite and sleep disturbance. Significant changes in appetite and sleep. With the appetite, what we're talking about here is, and in weight, a difference of at least 5% over about a 1 month period. So we're looking at changes in weight, as well as changes in sleep. Important to know they can go in either direction. It could be loss of weight, gain of weight, lack of sleep, sleeping too much. The main thing you're looking for here is there a significant change from the norm for that person, The other thing we can experience is, again, this can go in either direction, psychomotor, or just physical, if you will, agitation or retardation, meaning that I'm just physically, I don't move as much. I kind of feel a little more deadened, if you will, not physically as active. So psychomotor, either retardation, or I can be very agitated, kind of antsy with it as well. Oftentimes that'll go in conjunction with that, some experience of anxiety that can come along with depression. Number 6, fatigue, loss of energy. Depression really does zap the energy of the person. It's not as simple as, come on, you can get up and get moving and you'll be okay. It does impact the level of energy, and the person experiences fatigue. And this isn't about just getting enough sleep. It's just part of the condition. It really goes down to feelings of worthlessness or inappropriate guilt, or I should say maybe excessive guilt. Even in healthy times we can feel some guilt around things. This is when it gets really excessive, where the feelings of worthlessness become that way. And what will happen is they will become just such a dominant part of how I'm viewing myself, others, and the world. There's that kind of triad we're looking at, how I view myself, others, and the world. And often it will be marked by these excessive views of worthlessness or guilt in how we see them. Mentally, I'm impaired a bit. Poor concentration, indecisiveness. Oftentimes, in depression, a response that I will hear from someone is, I feel like I'm losing my memory. I was watching this show on TV last night, I can't even tell you what it was about. What I find is that in talking with the person, ask them, well, tell me when the show was on, what were you doing, what was going on? And find out that, with the depression, they were just ruminating, they were just thinking about something else. It's what we might call daydreaming in another, if it was more normative, but just that thinking about something else. And so what's happening is they weren't even focused or concentrating on the show, unable to really concentrate on it. So it wasn't so much that they watched it and then forgot, as much as they weren't even concentrating or focused on it in the first place, to take it in. So it's not so much they're losing the memory, as it is, that focus and concentration to take information in. The indecisiveness. I'm just not thinking as clearly, and my mood's affected, I'm just not able to kind of make decisions, feel confident about it, right? If I make a decision, I'm usually feeling confident about it. In this state, decision making is going to be much more difficult, much more difficult. Important to realize that recurrent thoughts of death or suicide are a common part of this condition. Common part. If you or you know somebody who's experienced this, again, know that this is a normal part of the disorder. Also know that talking about it does not increase the likelihood that the person will go out and commit suicide. So just if it's come up and you've asked them, are they having these thoughts? You're not going to lead them to start thinking about it and do it if they otherwise would not. Sometimes we're afraid around that area. So it's important to know that this is a common thing. And there's a range here we can be talking about as well. Meaning that it could range from just these thoughts of, I kind of wish I wasn't around, to I'm actively planning to go out and do something to hurt myself. I'm going to go to the store and I'm buying razor blades so that I can cut myself. Or I, in a sense, have an active plan and an intent to carry out that plan, right, on the very severe end of it. So again, a wide range of this, from thoughts of death and suicide. No matter what you hear on this, though, we take it as very serious and very important. And so you'd want to make sure that you're getting help for that one right away. The suicide hotline is a wonderful resource. So in terms of if you're not connected with a doctor, or even in clients I work with, they will have that number. Because if they may not reach me when they need to. And so they have that number as the backup to be able to talk to somebody if it's at that point. So important that that resource is available. And again, just that we are recognizing that this is going to be a common part of the condition. So I tossed out 9 different, these are the symptoms of the disorder. Again, at least 5 of them for a 2-week stretch would lead us to then look at the, if you will, diagnosis of depression, of major depression. Some of the additional factors I was alluding to. Lots of different ones now included in this new DSM, which I think is good, again, to recognize that there is such a variety in how this, how depression presents in folks. Number one, just that anxious distress. So some folks who more predominantly depressed, but experience a lot of anxiety along with it. Worry, rumination, that kind of on-edge feeling, right? Uppity, that sense that just always worrying about something, and that's there. Sometimes when they're both there, we might feel kind of tired yet wired. So I'm really tired, the depression has really hit me, but I'm also kind of worried, so I'm kind of antsy as well. Someone else referred to this as like a despairing anxiety. I can be really anxious, but internally I also have this sense of real, perhaps worthlessness. I'm in despair and kind of lacking hope in being able to do anything about it. So the anxious distress can be a part of it. Mixed features. Those of you here the last couple weeks, we talked about mixed features, someone who can experience some of the hypomanic feelings, not a full-on hypomanic state where we might think of bipolar disorder, but just have some of those kind of manic-y type symptoms or behaviors. And so we want to be able to recognize that. Melancholic features, old term melancholia. Even Freud wrote about this. It's more of that sense of real despondency or despair, that kind of sadness. That if that's more of a kind of one of the hallmark things, we might look and say, oh, there's some melancholic features there. Again, the real profound sadness, loss of pleasure, oftentimes experience worse in the morning, or having a lot of those early morning awakenings. Another one, atypical features. Kind of a catch-all for things that just don't sort of fit into anything else. It's not typical, it's atypical. Here, some of the things we might be thinking of. Someone who experiences depression, yet they can be really cheered up by a positive event. So their nephew and niece come around, and while they're there, they seem like they're in a really good mood, and they are in a good mood, and they're cheered up, and that can persist. And then after the event is over, the depressed mood kicks back in. So in a way where other times where depressed and in typical depression, you might think that even when some folks like that, the nephew and niece come over, maybe I'm a little brighter, but I'm still kind of more down in the dumps and in that depressed place, even when these things happen. Psychotic features can be part of severe depression. What we're talking about here essentially are either hallucinations, we talk about that, the voices are most commonly, hearing voices, hearing things that are not present. Again, auditory is going to be the most common type of hallucination. Delusions, having these fixed false beliefs. Paranoia, example of that. That's going to be the most common thing we'll see, again, in real severe depression. So that can happen. And again, it will only happen in the more severe points of depression. Catatonia, that kind of physical, almost like lack of movement, rigidity. This can be something we can see. Not common, but can see it. Peripartum onset. Now, most of you may be familiar with the term postpartum depression. And one thing that is important to know is that in 50% of the women who experience postpartum depression, 50% of them were experiencing depression before the birth, so during pregnancy. And in awareness of that, now whether it started before the birth or after, what we more commonly called postpartum, those are both kind of clustered together under this term, peripartum onset. And important to recognize that this is different than the baby blues, which are going to be much more common. This is going to go into the more severe realm of depression, and estimated somewhere 3 to 6% of women will experience this level of depression. Much higher number when we're just talking about the baby blues that a lot of moms can relate to. And then lastly, there's also just that qualifier of a seasonal pattern. Sometimes this has been known as seasonal affective disorder. Into the fall, into the winter, what we're really correlating with is the changes in sunlight. And now in Southern California, not as prevalent as it might be in a northern climate, where in winter months there's very little sunlight. Or if you live in Seattle, where you get rain many, many days of the year, you're going to have less sunlight. And so one of the treatments that actually has been shown to be effective when there is this seasonal pattern is the use of a light box. And so there are light boxes, and again, it's specific types of lights, so it's not a matter of turning on these fluorescent lights and standing under them for a few hours. It's the lights in the specific light box and the particular types of lighting that are helpful. And again, those have been shown to be very helpful for folks with this seasonal pattern. Even for folks in Southern California. You know, we go through our occasional rainy season or less light in the wintertime here as well. So if someone is very sensitive to that, then that's one other intervention that can be very helpful. So let's come back and talk a little bit about the difference between the blues and depression. It's going to be an important distinction for us to remember. As I mentioned, most folks can resonate with the experience of the blues, because the blues are a very common reaction to a stressful life event. And when I'm blue, primarily it's my mood that's affected. I'm down, I'm kind of in the dumps. I might use the word depressed because it's such a common part of our vocabulary, but that's just my sense, my experience. We know the blues are temporary. The blues kind of go away over time. When we experience the blues, it rarely would get to that point of where I'm thinking about suicide. So that level of severity. And when we have the blues, right, what do we need? We need the stuff that, you know, our friends and family can provide us. We need some time, we need some support, and to do some things to cope. I know I gotta just make sure I get out there and get out for my morning walk. I know I gotta make sure I'm going to the gym. I gotta make sure I'm just talking to my friends. I get myself to church, I pray. I do those things, and I know that time will get me through this. Depression, clinical depression, major depression. We want to really recognize that this is a condition or disorder, illness, whatever label we want to put on it, that there is a distinct condition we're calling clinical depression. And when this hits, kind of as that symptom list I gave you indicated, it affects multiple domains. Right? The entire experience, as I talked about earlier. Not just our moods, our thoughts, our body, our spirit, our relationships, all of those are going to be very much affected. Depression is persistent. Statistically, we might say an untreated depression will probably go about 9 months before remitting. It's a long time to suffer without getting any help. We also know that once a depression occurs, that it's more likely that that's going to occur again, right? It's recurrent. And so we want to recognize that. As I mentioned to you, suicidal thoughts can be a common part of this disorder. And we know that when we're talking about depression, we need to do all those things that we do when we have the blues, and it's really important to seek out some professional treatment that we'll be talking about a little later tonight. And one of the other ways that I really like to distinguish these two, when I have the blues, I have this sense that there's something wrong. There's things going on at work. Perhaps there's been a death. I'm trying to get through. Some stressor happened. I know there's something wrong. I'll get through it. It'll pass. I'll go through it. In depression, the experience is more of there's something wrong with me. It's not this thing out there. It's me. This thing may be going on out there, but essentially the problem is me. That sense of hopelessness or worthlessness, guilt, shame, all of those things. And so again, it's that focus more inward. Oftentimes it's been said that folks who are depressed are in many ways more sensitive than the general population. Because in many respects, that is accurate. That in depression, in that low place, I'm extremely attuned and sensitive. To a fault, if you will, in the sense that I take everything very personally, and everything goes inward. And I have that sense of shame, and shame, guilt, worthlessness, hopelessness. In fact, sometimes it's even shown that folks who are reported as happy or optimistic have a more optimistic view of things, whereas depressed folks might have, if you will, a more realistic view. The challenge is they're not able to see the positive possibilities that come out of it. They just see that realistic, and it tends to go towards the negative. It's sort of like, if I don't expect anything good, I can never be disappointed. If I don't expect anything good, then I'm not probably looking at that other side. I'm not hopeful around those things happening because I just see that's a setup for me. So I don't go there. And part of a depression might be one outlook that a person with depression might have. So we want to make sure, again, that we see these as different, because if I have the blues and think you have the same thing as I can say, come on, I got through this, you can do it too. Pull yourselves up by your bootstraps. You can do this. It just takes a little work. It takes a little effort. You got to change your attitude. Things that are helpful things in our culture, but can be counterproductive if that's all we do with someone with depression. Because, they just try and do that, but they're still depressed. I can't tell them, the sun's going to shine tomorrow's a new day. Let's look forward to that when they wake up feeling the same way that next day. So some of those things I have to be careful about with someone who's depressed, and step back again and understand what is their experience. What is it that they are going through? So putting all this together, a simple working definition of depression. Depression is a state of existence marked by a sense of being pressed down, weighed down, or burdened. So here's that kind of heaviness that comes with depression, which affects the person physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and relationally. As I've mentioned before, all aspects of the person. So anyway, experientially, it's that sense of being kind of weighed down, burdened, heavy, which is going to affect my entire being. So again, if I invite us now to look at this more holistic model of looking at it, I really like this better than I like the list of symptoms, because it's going to invite me to really think about how we all live. I live, I have thoughts, I have feelings, I have a body that's affected, all of those things. That's what I want to be aware of, as opposed to thinking of it as simply on one of these domains. And it could be a trap to do that in any way. If I just think of it as a medical condition, then perhaps I'm kind of pigeonholing it a little bit too much and not honoring the effect it has on my relationships or on my spirit. I just think of it as a medical condition. If I neglect the part of it affecting my body, that it's just an existential crisis I am going through, there's physiological things that are happening to my body that may also merit attention as well. And so if I only address myself or my loved one on one level, one aspect, we may miss some things. And so we take these symptoms and we put them on this spectrum, right? Physically, what's happening, right? The energy, the change of appetite, sleep, the restlessness or lethargy. Mentally, cognitively, what's going on? Again, the indecision, the poor concentration, suicidal thoughts, right? The content of my thinking is going to be more negative. Emotionally, in the depressed mood, I don't have that interest in things. The guilt, the shame, the hopelessness that's there. Now, these aren't going to be on the symptom list. Right? That DSM is more of a medical encyclopedia. So these two things won't be on there. But spiritually, right? How is it affecting my soul? Spirituality, in many respects, is where I derive my meaning and purpose. So often the experience is I lose that in the state of depression. So there's a sense of more profound despair. Maybe there's that sense of existential crisis. If I am religious, there may be that sense of disconnect or abandonment from God. I mean, part of what I'm dealing with depression. In relationships, we know that folks who are depressed tend to isolate. This is a common hallmark symptom of depression, isolation. So we'll see the person withdraw more and more during this period. The other thing that can happen too is there can be more tension in relationships. If you're my spouse and we're used to going out a lot and doing things, and now you're not doing this, and I'm kind of wanting you to do it, I'm probably trying to pull you to come out more. Come on, let's go out. We always have fun when we do this. You'll feel better if you do this. Let's go take a walk. Right? I'm kind of pulling for that. And maybe my spouse is pulling more of, I don't feel like doing this. I'm tired. I want to go sleep. Right? I want to isolate. And so there can be that tension. Right? Come on, if you just do these things, you'll feel better. Right? If I don't fully understand what's going on, there can be a lot of that tension. And perhaps even if I do understand what's going on, there can be that tension because it can be very difficult. Whether it's my son, my daughter, my spouse, my friend, going through that. So important that there's that understanding by the family as well. So I invite us to really take into account that holistic model. So having framed this and described it for you, next question is, well, what causes this? What causes depression? So here's our quiz, right? What causes it? Is depression caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain? One possibility. Is it caused by genetics? Does it run in families? Is depression caused by spiritual despair? Right? Something, again, disconnect. Is it really just a situational reaction to some circumstance? Right? I lost my job. A breakup of a relationship. Is that what causes it? Is it a response to loss? Right? There's been theory around this that really depression is about loss. And loss ranging from loss of a loved one through death to lost hopes and dreams, lost jobs, lost friends, any way that I experience a loss in my life. Is it really caused by the result of our childhood issues and the result of upbringing? So lots of different possibilities here. Is this what causes it? We could probably toss in what's not even on there. Is it temperament? Is it caused by one's temperament? Temperament is more that, the way the perspective we have, how we approach things. We're more born with a particular temperament. Is that what causes it? To throw all these out here. Well, if you haven't guessed, the answer is that all of them can lead to depression. All of these can lead to depression. There is no one cause of depression. It would be nice if there was. Make it easier for us to try and understand this. If we knew the one cause, maybe we could know some way to prevent this. But all of these things will factor into it. We'll kind of run through some of those. Important to realize that I'll illustrate chemical imbalance for you in a moment, but genetics, Just to talk about that, does depression run in families? The answer to that question is yes. We know that a first-degree relative is 2 to 4 times more likely to experience depression themselves, again, than someone who doesn't have a first-degree relative with it. So we'll see lots of ways that it does run in families. So as much as we talk about what depression is, we want to also recognize what depression is not. As I've already mentioned, it's not the blues that we all go through. Depression is not anyone's fault. Right? Now here's an interesting one, right? What can we put the blame on? Probably should rephrase that, because it's really, who can we put the blame on for depression? Who can we blame? And there's no real one person to put the blame on. And in fact, if we look at it as, where do I put the blame? We might keep ourselves stuck. Now, can I differentiate that from understanding? Meaning that if there was something I went through, if there were childhood experiences I went through, if there was a loss, if there was a stressor, it's important to understand how those affect me. And important to acknowledge that and to really go through that. That's going to be different than blame, which I always feel keeps us stuck. We stay stuck in blame. And so, again, depression is not really anyone's fault. It's not character weakness. If you have a strong character, you don't get depressed. That would be a myth. That would be a myth. Depression is not sinful. It's often any kind of mental health, mental disturbance might have been looked at as somehow being sinful. So you are being punished by God for acts of wrongdoing. And so you've been given depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, etc. It's not contagious. Or is it? Or is it? It is not physically contagious. It's not physiologically contagious. What there are shown is studies that if I looked at who my circle of friends was, and if I was around a lot of people who were depressed, it's going to affect my mood. And it's going to bring me down as well. So, does it affect us? Absolutely. Absolutely. So we want to be aware of that. Wouldn't call it contagious in the typical way of thinking of that term. But it certainly, again, can affect us. Now, no matter where depression comes from, regardless of which of those things might have been the initial cause from that list I showed you, once it hits, there is that imbalance in the brain. So I don't like to say that it's caused by the imbalance, because other things could have led to the imbalance. For some folks, perhaps it is part of their physiology. Or chronic depression, it runs in the family, this is what they experience. What you're seeing on this slide is level of activity in the brain. And I would really highlight the upper portion of this. This is a top-down look at a brain. And what we're looking at level of activity. And lower levels of the spectrum, the brighter colors, higher activity. The other end of the spectrum, the blues, are lower levels of activity in the brain. And so when you look on the left and you see that depressed brain, you're seeing lower level of activity, especially in that frontal lobe of the brain, than in this is the recovered brain. Someone who experienced depression was in recovery in a healthy place. You see that higher level of activity. What's so important about that is that, when we're struggling with something, say you're given a work project, and you need to figure it out, you can put your brain to work and try and work through that problem, figure it out, try different things and do things. And when you do that, it's that frontal lobe of your brain. It's this upper portion of the brain that fires and allows you to plan and think and organize and solve problems. It's the part that has insight, also empathy. It's the part that can multitask. All those very uniquely human skills. Those are all going to be taxed in depression. So I can't think as clearly, or I can't focus as well, can't make decisions as well, right? Because that part of my brain just isn't firing on all cylinders, as it would be when I'm in a good space. And so again, no matter where it comes from, when we're in a clinical depression, this is one of the effects that we will see, that it does go into the brain. A way of understanding this chemical imbalance, this is going to be I want to give you a very simplified way of understanding this. In our brain, there are many, many, many neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are the chemicals in the brain. And they're sort of like taxis in the brain, meaning that they take messages from one neuron, kind of one piece of our brain structure to another. And it's these chemicals that kind of carry the message from one area to the other. And one of the most common ones that you may have heard of is called serotonin. And we know serotonin is one of the chemicals impacted by depression. It's not the only one. It's not as simple as that, unfortunately, but it is one of them. And so what would happen in the brain is that, and if we look at this on the left, you would see that there, again, a message comes in on one nerve, and what we want to do is, there's a space in between. This is where that chemical taxi, serotonin is our chemical taxi, carrying the message now. And what happens? It goes out there, and it goes to the other nerve, and it does what we call it binds to that nerve, and so the message goes through. Right? So there's a message in one nerve, the serotonin, the chemical taxi, takes that message from one place to the next, and the message gets passed along. A simplified way of what our brain is doing millions of times every second. What happens in depression, and especially untreated depression, is now these messages come down, and the serotonin, if you will, goes out there, but it doesn't quite get across. Or maybe it gets across very minimally. And so that message doesn't, again, the processing speed that you just saw from the other one, it's not firing as fast. So the messages don't go through as fast. Right? That's slowed down. I'm not thinking, I'm not planning. All of that stuff is happening. Again, that slowed process that we'll see. So that's a very kind of simplified way of understanding it that we're going to revisit when we talk a little bit about medication, and how medication can help with this picture. So when we start talking about treatment, what's going to be important, again, is that we're going to address all aspects of the person. We're going to want to make sure that we don't just take a singular focus and think that it's medication alone that does this. It's exercise alone that does it. It's just talking. As long as I'm talking to someone, it does it. If we take a broader perspective, a more holistic view, as we start looking at treatment, I think it's going to be our best bet. So let's take a break for about 5 to 10 minutes. We'll come back and we'll talk more about all about the treatments. Okay, so let's move forward and talk about treatment. And as we do, a reminder of what I was talking about earlier, that so often what we want to do is look for where to place the blame. And what I want to invite us to do is rather the idea of taking responsibility. When we take responsibility, what we're doing is we are acknowledging the present. We're acknowledging what is happening right now. Acknowledging this depression. I am acknowledging perhaps some of those background factors or causes that are playing into it. And then I'm saying, what is it that I can now do to address this? What are at least the active things I can do to address this and take responsibility for my own process of recovery? And so I put that as a backdrop as we start thinking about some of the different treatments that we'll talk about. So your second quiz of the night is going to look at the various treatments, and I'm going to pose the question, which of the following can positively influence your brain chemistry? Number one, medication. Herbs, herbal remedies, St. John's wort, kava kava, those affect brain chemistry. Psychotherapy, does that affect your brain chemistry? Exercise, how about that one? Does that affect the brain chemistry? Yoga, meditation, or how about the Sudoku puzzle in your daily newspaper? Does that affect your brain chemistry? Well, the answer, once again, is all of them. All of them. It's important to realize that we're talking about brain chemistry, this idea that I have an imbalance in my brain chemistry. To recognize that our brain chemistry is always shifting and always changing. A roller coaster is going to cause some pretty big chemical imbalances in my brain when I go on a roller coaster. Just the experience of that, what that does to me. It's important to recognize that there's so many ways and so many factors and things that influence chemistry, as well as things that can help do it in a positive direction. So while we're going to talk about medication, we want to recognize that medication isn't the only thing. Talk therapy affects our brain chemistry. Exercise, all of the things on this list can positively influence and impact my brain chemistry. So again, once again, we're not just talking about do one thing, we're talking about the whole lifestyle, all aspects of our being that are affected. So let's talk a little about antidepressant medications. Antidepressant medications, studied by the CDC, showed that they were the most popular medication prescribed in the US since 2005. This is from a couple of years ago. They showed over a few years. The most popular medications prescribed in the US. Might be a surprise to think about that. Particular year, they were looking at over 118 million prescriptions were written. 11% of women and 5% of men were on antidepressant medications. So they are extremely common, far more common than we might think. Now, most of them are actually prescribed by primary physicians, not psychiatrists. Right? So the primary physician is now the primary prescriber of antidepressant medications. Are they overprescribed? Are they underprescribed? Answer to both is probably yes. Answer to both is probably yes. Perhaps too often. If someone goes in and just has a complaint around depression, the first thing that will be tossed out is the prescription, and not the other things that you're going to hear about tonight. On other occasions, person suffering, I can pull myself up, I don't need a pill, I don't need to rely on that, and goes through periods of suffering without taking it, or without being aware that what they're going through is in fact depression. So in many respects, I might think that they are both overprescribed and underprescribed. Bottom line is, right now, they are extremely common and only become more common as time goes on. Question, do I need to take antidepressant medication to treat the depression? Research around this has shown that for mild to moderate depression, research has shown treatment can be effective without medication. Can it be helpful? Yes. Can treatment be effectively done and depression be treated without medication? Mild to moderate? Absolutely yes. Moderate to severe depression, medication generally going to be recommended. Generally going to be recommended. As a way to go in and impact that physiology to, as I like to say, kind of put the person back into that driver's seat a little bit more so. In the throes of depression, the person does not feel like they're in the driver's seat of their own life. They may not even feel like they're in the back seat of their own life. They might even feel like they're in the car. And so sometimes in that real severe point, medication would be necessary. Sometimes in the severe point, hospitalization is necessary. Something to really kind of change things. So again, the bottom line answer to that one is a maybe. Is a maybe. Generally, the more severe the depression, then the more likely that we're going to want to be including antidepressants. If we look at this, because I said there's so many things that affect the brain chemistry. So So let's look at the top row. I start with medication to restore that chemical imbalance that we've talked about. It's kind of the pop thing you'll hear all the commercials. On TV, you're going to reference this one, right? Because they're advertising these medications. So medication does that. When that happens, boy, my thinking starts to clear up a bit. My thought processes are better. I can focus better. All these things are happening. I start getting out and doing the healthy behaviors that are good for me, like my exercise and connecting with others, not isolating so much anymore. Depression is reduced. What if I start on the other side? I start with therapy as a treatment to understand what's going on, perhaps help me think through some things, clarify my thought process a bit. I start to make some changes. One of the first things we start doing is talking about what are some healthy behaviors you can do. The exercise, the talking to someone, getting out in the daylight, good things. Well, you know what? All that has the impact of helping improve and restore my brain chemistry as well, and thereby reducing the depression. So again, there's different ways to kind of go at it. Good news is that we don't have to pick one. Good news is that we can look at this as a package. We can combine different things that are going to be helpful for us. And at the end of the day, I might know that, for me, it's these three things. And if I'm doing these three things, it's helpful. And I don't need to go through and figure out which is the most important one. I don't need to suffer by saying, okay, I'll just try two of them and take the third one away and see which is worse. No, I can do all three, and it's great. So the combination is probably what we're going to see as we go through with this. When we talk about medication, I mentioned this one last week as well, the idea that medications are always a trade-off. They're always a trade-off. There are definitely some benefits to taking these medications. Right? Medications stabilize some of the symptoms by helping restore the brain chemistry. Bottom line, my mood's better. My mood is improved. That's the good part about it. The not so good. Well, it doesn't address any of the other issues which perhaps led to the depression. The losses, perhaps the childhood issues, traumas we've experienced, whatever it might be that I also need to experience. How I'm thinking about things, my perspective. In fact, just going back to looking at those cycles, one of the things that was shown in more mild to moderate depression is that over time, folks who went through cognitive behavioral therapy that we'll talk about, one research study showed that folks who did that actually fared much better in the long run than folks who were on medication alone. Reason being is that when some of the symptoms started to recur, the folks who had experienced therapy had tools and knew what to do, unlike the folks who just relied on the medication alone to be able to treat it. And so it showed that the therapy actually was more beneficial in those situations. So again, the not so good about meds is that it doesn't address that side. We know it affects side effects, versus we know medication brings about side effects. And so nowadays, any commercial for a medication you see, predominantly all you're going to hear about are rapid fire side effects. Because now, legally, they have to say all of these things that the medication can bring. And so we're pretty clear that, and know that this is what happens with it. And of course, medication is not a cure. It treats the symptoms, but it's not a cure for the condition. I always like to talk about this idea of the trade-off, especially because if you're talking to a loved one about medication, it might be the easy route to say, just take this, it'll help you, you'll feel better. And we can describe it in a way that makes it sound like it's just all good. And again, it's not going to be all good and that it cures everything. It's going to bring side effects, so we want to recognize that. Yes, we want to emphasize that it can be helpful and how it can be helpful. We want to recognize both sides, again, to be realistic as we're talking to the person. As I mentioned before, there's these chemical messengers in the brain, and important to recognize that there's multiple ones that are implicated when we're talking about depression. So whether we're talking about serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, all of these, generally in depression, what we're seeing is a lack of those symptoms. And those will all lead to depression. Just to give you a very brief history of depression. The first antidepressant medications came out in the 1950s, which are called the tricyclic medications. In the 1960s, a new class came out called the MAOIs, monoamine oxidase inhibitors. You won't see these used too much anymore because there's a lot of different side effects to deal with. You might see them used when none of the other newer medications are working. 1988, that's the big change. Prozac. We've all heard of Prozac. That was introduced. It's the first of a class of drugs known as SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And this is when this real boon in antidepressants, therefore leading again by 20 years later to be the #1 drug prescribed. In large part because of Prozac and the lights that came after that. Since then, there have also been this class called the SNRIs, serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. So they don't just affect serotonin, they affect norepinephrine as well. And now there are so many, many choices, thankfully, of medication. So the good news is there are lots of choices. Sometimes the downside is we're not sure where to start. But the good news is that if one doesn't work, we have other choices. And these newer ones, again, while they do have side effects, much more tolerable than the old tricyclics and MAOIs that were out there for a long time. So the SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, what is this? Let's go back to that simplified model of brain chemistry. Right on the left, healthy, the message comes down, the serotonin goes out, it'll bind to the other the receptor nerve, and the message goes through. We said in depression, the message comes down, the serotonin goes out there, not as effective in binding, as we call it, to the other side, and so that message gets through much more slowly. So a medication, what does the medication do? What it does not, it's not a serotonin jolt. It's not adding serotonin to the brain. I want to be clear about that. What it's doing is now the message comes down. What the medication does, if you will, is the medication is up here. So that once the serotonin goes out, it can't come back up and get what we call a reuptake, taken back by the initial messenger. Or excuse me, by the initial nerve in the brain. So if you think about it, it's kind of like the message is put out there and travel the other way, and it can't go back. It can't go back to where it was sent. What happens again is the serotonin goes out there, and if it doesn't go across, it may go back to where it's sent in depression. The medication prevents that. It's inhibiting the reuptake of serotonin so that more likely than not, it will connect on and the message will get through. That's the simplified way of understanding. Or the most simplified way I can do something that is probably very complex to what's actually happening in the brain. And again, with the awareness that it's not just serotonin that's implicated in all of this, but this idea that the medications are helping the messages get through better. They're not, again, pills that are filled with serotonin, or pills that are filled with these neurotransmitters that we're adding into the brain. So what about some of these other things, like St. John's wort? St. John's wort is an herbal remedy and comes from a yellow flowering plant indigenous to Europe. And not coincidentally, it is used much more frequently in Europe than in the United States. And in fact, it's the most common treatment for depression in Germany. And what I would say is generally St. John's wort is effective, again, for the more milder levels of depression, that it can be helpful. And a lot of different folks will seek out more natural remedies, homeopathic remedies, and I never discourage someone from seeking out those types of helps and supports. I do want to point out, especially in the more severe forms of conditions, that we may need a little more than that. You don't have to stop doing those other things to consider an antidepressant medication. So again, things like this can be helpful, especially in the more milder levels of depression. So let's move from the physiological to talk a little bit about therapy. And therapy comes in all shapes and sizes. Many, many different types of therapy now. We might look, first of all, at even the question of who's in the room. Are we talking about individual therapy? Right? I'm working one-on-one with the person who's suffering with depression. Are we talking about couples therapy because it's happening in a marriage where one person is depressed? Do we involve the spouse? Or how do we involve the spouse? Is the whole family involved? Do we want to do that? Do we do group therapies? Do we want to do that? Our approach to this may be dependent on our own, as a therapist, my own background and how I've been trained and how I can work and how I can be effective with folks. Because all of these can be effective. It's not a matter of I have to just pick one. And it varies from person to person. Couples who I work with, I do a lot of couples work, where doing this makes the difference. This is a key part. Other times where it's the individual work that's absolutely necessary and needed. For other folks, the peer support, maybe not even group therapy, but peer support groups will be a very important aspect of treatment for some folks. So again, even who's in the room, if you will, is going to be different. What theory am I basing it on? Many different theories, many different approaches. Perhaps the two most common, and I'll touch on tonight, are the psychodynamic approaches and what are known as the cognitive behavioral approaches. But these are also going to be very varied as well. And there's other approaches beyond this that can be used and can be helpful. I'm going to mention again these two as being the most common. First, I want to talk about psychodynamic. If you will, psychodynamic therapy has its origins in Freud. It's probably the simplest way of getting a starting point for us. And what is it that dynamic therapy is really looking at? Dynamic therapy looks at the unresolved, often unconscious conflicts that exist within the person, right, within the psyche. What's going on internally for the person, their own experience of what's happening, helping to resolve them. Oftentimes, loss, trauma is seen as the underlying cause or trigger for the depression. It's much more of a psychosocial approach, if you will, what's going on emotionally and socially for the person, as opposed to physiologically. Typically, we're looking at issues rooted in childhood and family experience. I think this is going to be important to address for all of us. Anyone experiencing depression, it's good to at least assess what's going on here and understand how it contributed to what they're currently going through. And this is, again, important whether, we backtrack. It's important, certainly on the one hand, if we think about folks who experience those abusive or traumatic childhoods, that can be the precursor to their depression, and that may be the most dominant factor causing their depression. But it's so important to really assess this in everyone, because even when we have these experiences that we might look as good enough, I'm going to read you one quote. Harville Hendricks, who wrote the book Getting the Love You Want, he focuses on couples work. And what he talks about, or what he said, is that even if you were fortunate enough to grow up in a safe, nurturing environment, you still bear invisible scars from childhood. Because from the very moment you were born, you were a complex, dependent creature with a never-ending cycle of needs. Freud correctly labeled us as insatiable beings. And no parent, no matter how devoted, is able to respond perfectly to all of those changing needs. So often, it can be very subtle that these experiences of what seem to be good and good enough, there can also be hidden wounds or scars from that. And it's important that we recognize that. So often when many of the folks I deal with that can be the most challenging is when there are some of those background issues that aren't kind of the horror story. So I'll get the line like, well, I wasn't abused, I wasn't beaten, it wasn't really that bad. And so it's not about that. My parents were good. And they lose the awareness of what was missing, like in that quote reference, that no matter how good it was, there were still some things that were missing. There were still some losses, some wounds, some hurts that could be contributing to what's going on. And in that sense, the goal of psychodynamic work talks about making the unconscious conscious. That's kind of goes back to the idea of Freud, the idea if we can bring insight, then that can lead to change. And I would take it one step further. That insight I would look at as, in this model, a good first step. But the insight alone isn't going to lead to change, because if I've developed habits and patterns of behavior, insight alone isn't going to get me to change those things. Because there's a reason I've kept those habits. They've worked for me. And so change is going to be harder than staying the same. And so the insight will be a first step, but then there'll be a lot of work addressing how do I then actually make some changes? How do I do some things differently in my life than what I'm used to? So dynamic theory is very helpful in exploring those things, exploring those other factors, exploring what we experience internally, validating that experience to help try and address, in this case, depression, underlying issues that may be there. Let's talk about cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy is research proven to be effective with depression. So a lot of research behind cognitive behavioral work. More research behind CBT than any other form of psychotherapy out there, especially when we're talking about dealing with depression. Based on a very simple ABC model. So really at cognitive behavioral therapy, I'm looking at the thought process. When we think about traditional therapy, the first question you probably imagine being asked is, how you feeling? And in CBT, while I am curious about how you're feeling, I'm really curious about how you're thinking and what you're thinking. The ABC model. A is the activating event. What was the trigger? The triggering event. Could be I lost a job. Could be I had an argument with somebody. B, what's my belief about the event? How am I interpreting this? How am I seeing this? And then C is going to be the consequences, my feelings or behaviors. Now, you can probably imagine if I am depressed, how I'm interpreting what's going on around me is going to be very skewed. It's like wearing dark glasses. I wear sunglasses all the time. And so everything I see is darkened. It taints my view of the world and of other people. And that's how I will see things. So I may walk into a room and look around and think, nobody likes me. I'm feeling depressed. Nobody came up and said hi to me. You know, there's something wrong with me. Nobody likes me. That's just the way I will view things. And what typically happens, really all of us, is that an event happens and we feel a certain way. Oh, this thing happened, I felt sad. This thing happened, I felt happy. This thing happened, I reacted by yelling back at you. You said this, so I yelled back at you. And what is missed and overlooked is the B in this. How I'm thinking about it and the beliefs that I have around it. Because that is really what's going to make the difference. It can be very quickly because our brain works so fast. It can seem like it's instantaneous. So if you yell at me, I yell back at you. I didn't stop and think about that. I just did it. But if I'm going to learn a new way, I'm going to have to learn to stop and recognize that, how I'm thinking about this, how I can actually do something about how I react to situations. And also about how I'm feeling about it. The goal here is going to be to identify those negative, maladaptive thoughts, maladaptive patterns of thinking, and to try and replace them with those that are going to be positive, also realistic and adaptive. And we'll talk about that more in a second. There's some very common patterns of limited thinking that I want to talk about a little bit with you. And as I go through these, to an extent we can probably all relate to them. The key thing to take away is that when I'm in a real depression, when I am really anxious, that I'll probably take these to a higher level. It'll be much more intense, much more to an extreme. So, common list here of patterns of limited thinking or patterns of distortion. Black and white thinking, what's called polarized thinking. This is when I look at things in absolutes, black and white categories. I have to be perfect or I'm a failure. There's no middle ground or there's no gray area. I'll use words like always and never. I'm never going to get another good job again. People always treat me this way. They always treat me badly. So I get into that more skewed way of doing it. Overgeneralization. Overgeneralization is when I view a single negative event as kind of a never-ending pattern of defeat. So that idea of I lost a job and I'm never going to be able to find another good job again. One event happened, I've kind of put it out there as it's going to be never-ending. In the sense I've reached a conclusion based on just one piece of evidence. It's going to be absolute. Discounting the positives. Again, those dark glasses, I only see the negative. I don't see or experience any of the positives in my life, or even the ones that, yeah, you can tell me that are there, I don't really feel them. Right? Yeah, I know I should be grateful that I have my family around me. I get it. I don't feel it. It doesn't do anything for me today. I just don't see anything good about myself either as well. Things that I've accomplished, I just see those as taken for granted. Whereas the things that are my failures are really my fault. So in a sense, there's no way for me to win in that scenario. Personalization. The example I gave you. I walk into a room, you didn't come and say hi to me, it's because you don't like me. I've personalized your actions and what you are doing. I assume that what you do or say is a reaction to me. And I make things all about me. So it can feel like an attack. And again, when depression can be very severe, I can get suspicious or even paranoid around others and think that you're actually doing things to try and make me feel worse or hurt me or to be against me. That that's what your intention is. And I've got that locked in. And nothing's going to change my mind around that. They're really personalized to the nth degree. Mind reading. Again, I'm assuming what you're thinking. And again, it's probably going to be in the negative when we're talking about depression. And so without their saying so, I know what you're thinking and feeling, and I know why you act the way that you do. Jumping to conclusions. Kind of like fortune telling. Right? I'm looking ahead. I can predict the future. I know what the outcome is going to be. I already know what you are thinking. Right? I've already got that. I've already assumed what that is. Right? I'm going to anticipate things are going to turn out badly. And feel convinced that my prediction is not just a prediction, but it's an already established fact that things are going to come out badly. So I see no other possibilities. That one's a real good one when we talk about that, what's called the self-fulfilling prophecy. Right? I predict the bad thing that's going to happen. Where I think it's going to happen, I'm acting in ways that are going to create it to happen, and then it happens. And all that does is reinforce that, see, my prediction was right in the first place. It had nothing to do with what I did, because that was just going to happen. So we can get stuck there. Another one is should statements. A lot of the guilt's going to come in here. We criticize ourselves or others by telling the way things should be. Shoulda, coulda, woulda, right? Oughts, musts, have tos. This is the way things should be. I have this list of rules of how people should act. When they violate those rules, I get angry at them. I violate those rules. I should have done this. I should have known better. Should have seen this coming. Now I'm upset and mad at me. I'm very critical of me. In depression, often in anxiety as well, I'm my own worst critic. My harshest critic out there is me. And we carry that one around. What our efforts are going to be in CBT, again, is to identify what is that negative thought, what's the distortion, that negative pattern that I was just describing. For some folks, it helps to be able to put the label on it. Like, okay, I get it again. I'm jumping to conclusions again. I can see that. Some folks find it very helpful. And from there, I want to substitute something else. But now the key is it's going to be more accurate, but also more positive and realistic. And it's got to directly challenge that negative thought. And this is very different than just having a positive affirmation. This is very different than saying, the sun's going to come out tomorrow and it's going to be a brighter day. Because I wake up tomorrow, I'm still feeling depressed, the sun came out, it's not a brighter day. It's not trying to convince myself of things that are not realistic. It's more about trying to get something that will confront the distorted part of what I'm thinking. So if I did lose a job, and I'm thinking, I'm never going to get another good job again. No one's going to hire me because no one likes me. So I might be aware that, okay, I'm really jumping to conclusions here. I'm personalizing. I'm getting extreme in my thinking about it, overgeneralizing it. The answer isn't going to be, we'll go to the other side. Tomorrow I'm going to get that new job. When tomorrow comes and I don't get it, I'm going to feel more depressed. It's more about looking back and seeing that, okay, on that job, were there some successes? Was there positive feedback I got? The fact that I was hired showed there were positive qualities. So I might go through and start looking at some of those things in a way that I can at least acknowledge and accept some of those. If I'm thinking nobody likes me, perhaps I'm able to see that, okay, there are people that, even when I'm feeling down, that I would call my friend. Or there are people that support me. So again, the idea here is I'm trying to develop a more positive but yet more realistic, and when I say adaptive, one that's going to help me cope a little bit. So it's not about thinking it's just going to make me feel a little better tomorrow, but that, okay, gosh, so if I do take that walk tomorrow, because it does help me a little bit. I'm not cured, but I do feel a little more energy when I get out there and do that. So I guess it's a step in the right direction. Okay, I'll try it. I'll keep going. I don't have to be convinced that it's going to be perfect for me, but I'll try it. So CBT, again, really going to hone in on these thought patterns and thought processes, and we'll look at our thoughts as being what lead to our feelings. The self-help books are going to be things like, change the way you think, you can change the way you feel. That's what they're going to talk about. And most of the self-help books out there are going to be based on cognitive behavioral approaches, because there are a lot of those self-help tools that we can do. So we talked about the body, we talked about the thinking. Let's just talk a little bit about the emotional part, and the emotional life. In depression, the opposite of depression is expression. Depression, everything going inward. Expression, we know, will be a helpful part of coping with it. And so a key to coping is finding outlets to express myself. This could be expressing myself verbally through talking with somebody. It can be through any artistic or creative endeavor that I might do. Things that help kind of get me out of myself a little bit. Instead of just kind of going inward and ruminating about my internal world, I'm doing things that bring me out. And so this is a way, emotionally, to kind of address depression and deal with depression. Finding ways to express myself in a healthy way. One that's not up here that might go along with this as well is the awareness of how depression is affecting me in the body. Somatically is the fancy term we would use. So when I am depressed, where do I feel it in my body? And can I address things on that level? When I feel anxious, when I feel depressed, I feel it in my stomach. Or I feel the sense of being weighed down. And I can go in and just kind of work with a person on that level and understand how things are affecting them physiologically and just address it that way. And oftentimes the body becomes the source for communicating what the person is feeling. I don't really know what's going on. I don't know how to describe it. I feel it here. You feel it in your stomach. Notice that. What is it you notice? Is it hard or soft? Is it cold? Is it hot? Is it tension? What is it that's there? And then I might invite the person, okay, give that sensation a voice. What would it say? It might say, I'm really tired of this. I don't know what to do about this. I'm feeling frustrated. Whatever it might say. So again, the body becomes a way of, or a source of communication. A source of that communication. So often, in some of the, what I was talking about before, more subtler ways of childhood experiences that can be hidden kind of mini traumas, if you will. The losses and such that are experienced in childhood. It's the body that will really, if you will, betray us. We think things were okay, there's nothing really there, but my body does experience it, and it'll come out in different ways. And if I don't, in fact, address that, it's going to affect me physiologically. And I'm going to have increased illnesses, immune system conditions. Everything from blood pressure and muscle tension, cholesterol, all that stuff can be starting to be affected if I'm not addressing what's going on with me physiologically. Or if I'm not addressing, what's going on with me psychologically, if I'm not addressing it, my body's going to pay the price for it. So again, the body becomes another way of not only assessing, but helping to bring that out. And that's why practices such as yoga is so important. Because they do things that are physiological as well as emotional or spiritual. Right? They're physiological things that help start shifting things in the body. Stuck in the cycle of isolation. I feel too depressed to talk about my depression. I feel too depressed to go to my depression support group. Right? Might sound kind of funny, but that's going to be the case. In that state of depression, I don't even want to go out to do anything. And so you want to recognize this is part of it. And so, your loved one is experiencing this real severe depression, not to push it too hard, but to try and invite into small steps that they can do or are willing to do with you and help bring them out some. Spirituality. So again, what is our spirituality? If we were to try to define this, we might say it's the feelings, thoughts, and experiences and behaviors that arise from a search for the sacred. It's the belief that there is some dimension of experience greater than you, beyond you, which also exists within you. It's an awareness of the transcendent in oneself, one's relationships, and the world around us. This awareness moves us to transformation, bringing us meaning and purpose. Meaning and purpose. How do I view myself in that more deeply meaningful way, existential way? How am I seeing things? How am I seeing myself and the world? So when we experience spiritual despair, right? Okay, where is it? I'm deriving my meaning and purpose. Do I feel a loss in that? Do I feel no purpose? Which would be a hallmark in severe depression. And if I'm religious, what is my relationship like with God in the present struggle? Am I feeling abandoned by God? Am I feeling angry with God? Am I feeling an emptiness? I think it's very important that we can talk about this and address this. And in psychotherapy, I think it's a very important thing to talk about and be able to address. And again, know that wherever the person is at, wherever I'm at in those feelings, it's okay and I can talk about that. I like to say, if you're angry at God, it's okay to talk about it because I think He can take it. He can take your anger. And you know what? He probably already knows you are anyway. So if it's there, let's bring it out and talk about it. Whatever it is, it's okay. Let's bring it out. Let's address this. One of the features in a healthy spirituality and a healthy way of looking at ourselves is compassion. Compassion. Latin, com pate, to suffer with. So if I have compassion for you, I am suffering with you. It's different than sympathy. Sympathy is kind of like, I kind of know what you're going through because I've been through it. But we often think of like the sympathy card if you've lost a loved one, because we can probably resonate. Because I've lost a loved one. I have an idea of what you're going through, but it's based on more of what's going on for me. When I have compassion, when I have empathy, I am kind of stepping in your shoes, and I'm able to have compassion for what your experience is, and awareness that it's different from my experience. Even if we have some shared ones or some similar ones, I still recognize that yours is going to be different, and I can sit with you in that experience. Extreme challenge to respond with compassion to ourselves versus that self-criticism, which is so much a part of depression. Right? We're our own worst critic. And so we sit with it and we think we should be able to do something about this. Or, okay, I understand, I get it, this is what's going on, but now I should be over it by now. So I have maybe one level of compassion, but then I kind of get on myself for not doing it quick enough. So there's still that self-critical voice that's going to be there and going to be a part of what I'm dealing with. And this real challenge. And what is really needed is this new response of understanding and empathy. And this is where, as a friend or family member, and certainly in good psychotherapy, what a person who's depressed will experience is that I can sit with you and have that sense of feeling accepted by you. You accept me for who I am. You understand me for who I am. And through that, it's just one way the person perhaps can start to do that for themselves. The story of a colleague who shared, was talking with a woman he worked with who had been depressed, and she was at a much better place. And he asked her, he goes, so what was it? I mean, how'd you do this? How'd you get better? How'd you feel better? And she goes, you mean you don't know? And he goes, no, what was it? And she goes, I watched how you sat with me, and then I learned to sit with myself in the same way. So she really took in how this person who cared and had compassion for her was with her. And she started doing that for herself. A wonderful place if we can get to that. If we can all get to that place in our life, to have that kind of compassion. Our background influences are going to get in the way of that. If we have a lot of negative relationships, negative messages that have been ingrained in there for a long, long time, it's going to be real hard to do that. Little steps towards that, steps in that direction, I think are so, so important. Last thing I want to mention, mindfulness. Mindfulness is our newer buzzword here in the last 10 years. It's become such a popular term. To make it simple, mindfulness practices have been around for centuries. It's just now this term has come up because our science has been able to go in and look in the brain and see what happens when we're doing these things. What are we talking about? meditation, yoga, muscle relaxation, deep breathing exercises, contemplative prayer. Again, practices that have been around for centuries. And we've always known them to be effective. Science now kind of can go into the brain and understand why that is. Because we've seen brain changes in folks who engage in these practices. They provide grounding for mind and body. They're very holistic in this way, which is why, again, they're so very effective. They increase the ability to observe one's experience without being swept away by it. Might help us in that quest for being more compassionate. I can look upon myself or look upon something without that critical eye and begin to observe what's happening and try to take a different perspective upon it. So I highly encourage these. I will often, even as a part of therapy, engage in these practices. So in a session, some breathing exercises, muscle relaxation and the like, to help kind of ground the body. Because once we get into stuff, it's in the body. It's in the body. And so sometimes we need to do something to just address the body before we can kind of address what's going on. All right? If you think about it, if you're anxious and you get really amped up, right? Your brain's going, and you're trying to think and solve through something. You probably do yourself a benefit if you do an exercise to kind of bring yourself to a place of calm and then try and think through it. Kind of makes common sense for all of us, doesn't it? But if we're experiencing significant depression or anxiety where we're seeing those thought patterns are distorted to kind of an exponential degree, then even more beneficial for us and more necessary to have practices like this. So to put this all together, where would we begin? First, I'll encourage you to start with small, achievable steps. Start with some small, achievable steps. If I could recommend one thing, I'd say start with the body. And that would be exercise. That would be exercise. Number one treatment recommendation for depression is going to be exercise. So if you're not doing any, it starts with some walks. If you're walking, walk more frequently. You get to the gym, go to the gym. Do it more frequently, do it more often. It's going to be very, very beneficial. Exercise. Does it change brain chemistry for the better? Right. Yes, you already know that one. Second thing would be to connect in some way. So again, I'm really thinking about isolation as such a hallmark symptom. How can I connect? Talking to someone who is supportive. It may be a good friend, it may be a family member, certainly can also be a therapist. So talking to somebody. So again, the idea that I'm doing something to at least bring this stuff out, to express a bit and start getting out of myself. So those are two things where I would definitely start with. And not really touching on it into depth tonight, but one of your handouts has what I'm calling the Recovery Promotion Plan. And this is where I can more specifically go in. And essentially what I'm doing here is I'm identifying what are the main symptoms I experience with my depression. Because again, I don't want to just look at the textbook. I want to apply it to me. Okay, what are the main symptoms that I experience? And make a list of those. What are some of the main healthy activities that are going to be good for me? We can list out 100 of them. I want to try and do 100 things. Let's make a list of 5 or 6 of those as well and start with those. So I know what to look for trouble. I also know what are the healthy behaviors that start me in the path toward recovery. And of course, lastly, I'll mention the importance of seeking out mental health treatment, therapy, and/or medication. With that, let me pause and just take a couple questions, because I think I'm already at time, but I'll take 2 questions, and then I'll be happy to stay around after if folks want to have some more. Yes?
2 questions for you. With our improved knowledge on the depression this evening, thanks to you, when we have a spouse/significant other, how does one be supportive and yet not get ourselves hurt? Number 1 question. Number 2 question, is there a correlation between nutrition/diet and depression? Thank you.
Let me repeat those questions. First, thank you for the comments, and let me go in reverse order because I remember the second one first. about the impact of nutrition and diet on depression. I would say yes, there's definitely some beneficial impacts of nutrition. I would think about it, just like when I was talking about the supplements before, that it's going to be helpful. I don't want to say nutrition can be a cure if I'm in a major depressive episode, but anything I put into my body is going to make a difference. On the extreme end, if I'm putting in alcohol and drugs, it's going to negatively affect me. On the healthier side, if I am eating healthier, if I am eating good proteins, am I eating fruits and vegetables, am I eating a healthy diet, as opposed to, and probably in depression, generally a lot of carbs. Probably better if I'm anxious, because they're probably going to have that dampening effect. When I'm depressed, I probably don't need more of the dampening effect. So I might think about more proteins if I'm depressed. Perhaps one possibility. But again, eating healthy. The sugars, the caffeines, all that stuff that are going to spike our chemistry, probably not too good for us, because we're just going to get some short-term effects, but then the crashing part afterwards. So definitely balanced diet is going to be healthy. Your first question, how do I support, encourage, without getting hurt myself? Great question, great question. If I am a caregiver, and I'll certainly talk about this last week of the series, if I'm a caregiver for someone going through any kind of mental illness, I'm at an increased risk myself for physiological and emotional conditions, depression, anxiety, health things. And so it's going to be a balance. It's going to be a balance. I want to support and encourage. One of the things, because again, that whole last week is really going to talk about it. One thing I'll mention here now is that if I try to approach it without expectation, it will help me from getting hurt. If I have expectations that this is going to change you, or if I can do this, you will change, I'm more likely going to set myself up for hurt. I do want to sometimes balance that with some hope. I don't want to not have any hope, because sometimes I may be the only one that carries the hope for my spouse or for my family member, whoever that is. I may be the kind of the bearer of that hope. And so I want to hold on to some hope, but without expectation. That would be one way. I would certainly, again, maybe invite you back the last week when we talk about all sorts of ways to take care of ourselves and help our loved one as well. Last question, yes?
Is it hard to diagnose, let's say, a patient that you've seen for the first time with depression versus bipolar, since a lot of the criteria, to me, is very similar, and my son has had every diagnosis in the book. So when you see someone for the first time, is it hard for you to pinpoint that?
So the question is it hard to diagnose upon the first meeting? Specifically, is it hard to diagnose depression versus bipolar disorder? And yes, it can be a challenge. Sometimes it's pretty straightforward. Certainly if it's more like what I've talked about tonight pretty clearly, and you don't get any of the complicating factors or other things there, most people aren't like that. We don't kind of fit so neatly. With bipolar disorder, again, the essential distinction is I'm going to be also looking for things on that higher side. Periods of that either elation or heightened irritability, racing thoughts, all the symptoms that I would maybe describe the first couple weeks of our series, those are going on as well, would lead me towards bipolar. And again, I could probably say the same for all the other different symptoms that we'd be looking for. And again, lastly with it, I'll say that we could have depression and other conditions as well. And so we might be aware that we're treating multiple things there as well. So can it be tricky? Yes. We want to be astute with it. Certainly if possible, if there's family involvement, that's going to help quite a bit, because it'll give me another lens through which to look. Not that I will just accept one and not the other. It's putting them both there, and it gives me another lens through which to see things. And that's going to be very helpful to me as well. So with that, I would like to thank you for being here tonight. Again, these next couple of weeks, we're going to talk about schizophrenia. The week after that, we're going to talk much more about trauma and post-traumatic stress. If we weren't doing that week, we probably would have talked much more about trauma tonight. So we'll talk about that. And then again, that last week, we'll talk all about the helpful roles and skills that you as family members can take to help your loved one. So thank you very much. Look forward to seeing you in the future.